Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Derek Thompson, a staff writer at The Atlantic. Welcome to Office Hours, where we talk about all things progress, the abundance agenda, really anything that you guys want to discuss about my work at The Atlantic or my guest work at The Atlantic. My guest today is Robinson Meyer. He is a staff writer at The Atlantic who writes about energy policy and climate change and environmentalism. Rob, thank you so much for being here. It's great to see you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So you are here to talk about climate change and the Inflation Reduction Act and the future of green energy policy. Let's start with the piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, which Joe Biden plans to sign just this week. It is, number one, exquisitely named because headline inflation is likely going to have peaked the exact same month.
We can hope. We can hope.
Yes, one hopes. I'll knock on, there's no wood necessarily surrounding me.
Here.
Pretend wood. There you go. I want to focus specifically not just on the inflation reduction aspects of this bill, but on the energy provisions of this bill, what this bill does to America's energy picture. So before we review exactly what the bill does, I'd love you to give us a thesis statement to start off. Like, remind us why this piece of legislation is so significant and why it seems to have done the impossible and gotten environmentalists to say hopeful things about America and its relationship to the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we are going to be able to, with any luck, we are going to be able to divide climate policy and the history of climate change and how the US reacts to it in the United States into two eras, before the Inflation Reduction Act and after the Inflation Reduction Act. That is how important this piece of legislation is. And the reason is not only what it does, it is that since climate change became a major public policy issue we can say 1989, since it kind of became an issue in the 1990s, the Senate has always been the obstacle to passing major climate policy. And that the reason for that has changed. It was kind of originated in both parties, then it became a specifically Republican issue, but the Senate has always been the obstacle. The House has passed lots of climate bills, the Senate has not. And domestic and global climate policy kind of started to conform itself in this almost like quite twisted way to the Senate's negligence. The Paris Agreement is actually written in a way down to the word such that the Senate does not need to ratify it for the US to participate. This is the first piece of comprehensive climate legislation the Senate has ever passed. And the first piece of legislation aimed at really bringing down emissions across the economy. And for that reason alone, it represents a huge change in America's kind of outlook and role in the fight to decarbonize the planet.
Yeah, you wrote this great piece in The Atlantic about how the Senate provides this really interesting bookend to climate policy in the US. It was the Senate that first raised the prospect of the US needing a policy response to climate change in the 1980s. Then you have essentially, 30 years of just about nothing happening in the Senate. And now finally we have this happy bookend where the Senate is, or at least Manchin and Schumer and Democrats have come to the rescue and revived that initial dream of the Senate acting on climate change. You and I have already discussed aspects of this on my podcast, Plain English, and I don't want to do like a full recapitulation of that conversation, but you did such a great job of summarizing what's in the bill with this 1, 2, 3 breakdown of its most important provisions. So before we talk about like the analysis and the so what here, could you just do a really quick 1, 2, 3 of what is in this bill that's really significant on climate change?
Yeah, the funny thing is I don't remember if this is the same 1, 2, 3 I gave you on the podcast, but 1, 2, 3. The first thing,
I'm only interested in
as long as it's 3. Yeah, exactly. Classic. So the first thing is it makes clean energy cheap. It makes it cheap for consumers via tax credits, many of which will work like direct subsidies, including for electric vehicles. And the second is for companies, both in companies like utilities that make and sell electricity by making it very cheap for them to install zero carbon electricity, and then also for companies that run large industrial facilities, or for companies that run warehouses that want to reduce their energy use, or install solar panels on the roof. The second thing is that it develops and provides a path to commercialization and scale for the new technologies that we need to decarbonize parts of the economy we don't actually know how to decarbonize yet. We know how to make electricity, in a zero carbon way, we don't really know how to make steel quite yet, or how to make some chemicals. And a lot of the policies in the bill focus on creating an industrial base in the US and creating incentives that will get us to where we can do those things in the 2030s and beyond. And the third is that it creates both a new green bank and disperses a lot of grants and loans that are meant to make it so that communities, let's say disadvantaged communities kind of across the partisan scale, both largely white rural communities that maybe had a coal plant or coal mine leave, and also what tends to get called kind of idiomatically EJ communities, which are really, you know, communities of color, Black and brown neighborhoods that maybe had an industrial site or are near a fossil fuel facility that has imposed a lot of environmental damages on them, a lot of health problems.
EJ meaning
environmental justice. Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of grants and loans in the bill, like tens of billions of dollars, to make it so that those places can develop in a new lower carbon way. And then if there is major remediation or there needs to be, you know, development done in the community, that it can happen.
Right. So I want to think a little bit about the compelling criticisms of this bill. I don't want to just praise it without consideration for the other side. So the first criticism that I'm aware of is that there are some people, especially libertarians and sort of corporate style, Romney style Republicans, who might look at the IRA and the CHIPS Act, which is another piece of legislation which subsidizes the manufacture of computer chips in America, which to compete with decades of subsidies, state subsidies from countries like China. And they see these two bills, the IRA and the CHIPS and Science Act, and they say, this is the beginning of a new kind of economic policy that is a little bit freaky to me, because it looks like industrial policy. It looks like the US is picking winners. We are choosing solar, choosing wind, choosing to build computer chips in America, and subsidizing their production. And I can imagine this libertarian saying that, you know, when Washington gives subsidies with strings attached, companies become less competitive. They become less innovative. Businesses learn to follow whatever Washington wants them to do rather than to follow the signals from the market. So what do you say to this criticism from sort of the libertarian right that this bill represents a freaky kind of new industrial policy?
Well, it's kind of funny, first of all, because the whole reason that these policies have come to the forefront is because American companies are no longer successfully competing with those firms that receive subsidies or receive help. You know, there is no American equivalent of TSMC, the Taiwanese semiconductor fab that makes the most advanced chips in the world. That's why Congress passed the CHIPS Act. If this kind of policy made it impossible for companies to compete, then why would we need the CHIPS Act in the first place? Kind of the proof is in the pudding, and what the proof says is that these kinds of policies work. The second thing, more broadly, is that
let me just stop you. I want you to keep going, but just to be like a David Ricardo for a second in the most annoying of possible ways. Okay, let's say China wants to subsidize the manufacture of computer chips, right? So now they're making computer chips essentially at a loss, really cheap computer chips, and now we can buy them. We can benefit. Our computers are cheaper because China's throwing all this money at computer chips. Why not just live with that arrangement and say, well, we're just going to buy cheap computer chips from, you know, Taiwan and China and all these other countries rather than subsidize our own domestic market? What's the problem with that?
Yeah, so I think what we have seen is that, first of all, there's a second part to that argument you normally hear, which is, of course, Apple will still exist and it will benefit from those cheap computer chips. We'll all have cheaper iPhones. We'll all have cheaper laptops because China's subsidizing these computer chips. The first argument is that there has been no country in history where they only got up to like halfway up the value chain and then stopped. And then we're like, well, we're done. We're not going to try to compete with Apple now. If we value Apple and we think it's useful for Apple to be here, all those countries whose development strategies were kind of seeding the lower half of the value chain to are going to keep trying to come up the value chain. They're going to try to keep competing with Apple, competing with Facebook, competing with Google. And suddenly these companies that we think of as the growth engines of the United States will be overtaken as well. The second thing is that a lot of the arguments you hear in this vein kind of assume this like implicit difference, this inherent difference between how well a thing works, how it's designed, and how it is made. But when you actually look at the development of many industries, including one I know really well, which is the development of the solar panel industry and photovoltaics, what you see is that there's a ton of knowledge and a ton of improvement and process improvement that happens on the manufacturing side. For a long time in solar, we thought that there were going to be these big scientific breakthroughs that would create more inherently efficient solar panels. But that actually didn't happen. Where a lot of the advancement in solar came from was Chinese firms just like churning out a ton of solar panels and getting a tiny bit better, a tiny bit more efficient, and all these little steps. And they added up to a huge process, a huge improvement that was like a stepwise change. Anthropologists call this like tacit knowledge, the kind of knowledge that engineers and line workers pick up from actually doing the thing. And by not having an industrial base in the United States, by kind of seeding that industrial base, the US is giving up on developing all that tacit knowledge and being able to take advantage of it here.
So you are in the process of working on what I understand to be a very, very long piece in the thousands and thousands of words about America's emerging industrial policy.
Yes.
Give people who are watching, probably watching on YouTube later, like the full rundown of exactly what you're going to say in that piece. I want them to read it. But maybe can you share like a little insight that you have looking at what's being created, looking at what's being crafted by the Biden administration and Democrats? There's one little nugget that you're very interested in as you see like this dawning of a new industrial policy.
So there's two things I would say. The first is that what is really notable about this industrial policy, first of all, is that it is really not limited to the Democrats. And so in some ways you can see it most clearly in clean energy because Democrats are willing to go further with these policies, and they're willing to, they have a goal in mind about how they want the economy to look, which is they want it to be decarbonized. But you can see it in semiconductors, for instance, right? CHIPS was a bipartisan bill. There is now a bipartisan kind of consensus that the US should take a stronger hand in reshaping the economy and pointing the economy towards certain development outcomes than there was before. I'd say also we should really look at the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act is the formal name, as part of this big turn to industrial policy. There were a number of demonstration projects funded that were actually clean energy demonstration projects funded by that law that the IRA is kind of going to pick up and carry to final commercialization. But there is a growing bipartisan consensus, to use Washington language, around industrial policy. And I think the question is only how far it goes. The second thing, just to like say one thing, is that this is a deeply American thing to do, that actually 200 years ago, there were understood to be like two different ways you could develop your country. The first was free markets and everything, we just trade, that's how it works, which was understood to be kind of the Anglo way, the British way of doing things. But there was another way of doing things, which was that you have high tariffs actually on commodities, and you make a lot of internal infrastructure improvements to encourage a lot of internal domestic trade, which in order to basically keep commodities inside the country, try to get manufacturers inside the country to develop high tech, very high tech exports, and then export just your high tech goods. That was understood as the American way of doing things. And there were German economists who came to America to study this way of developing your country that then later informed how the Japanese and Taiwanese and South Korean economies developed. There is this secret hidden American economic tradition that is much, pragmatic economic tradition that has almost been forgotten, I think, by American economists, but that is as essential to the country's history as the kind of free market economic tradition is. And I think one thing we're seeing now is both parties are getting more comfortable returning to that bipartisan pragmatic tradition.
I love that, a secret American system. That's very interesting. And I can see how, I mean, I love any story that points out the ways in which economic or cultural policy today or cultural trends today are actually a recapitulation of things that happened 100 years ago. So I cannot wait to read that.
The funny thing is they literally called it the American system in the 1820s and 1830s. Henry Clay, who was like the big, senator who kind of argued for it, called it the American system as opposed to the British system.
Yep. I think I have a book, like just to my right over here, called The American System about Henry Clay in the 1840s. So if you hadn't already written it, then I guess I would recommend it. We're starting to get some questions from the audience, so I want to jump quickly to some of those. There were questions about how exactly funding for advanced industry and manufacturing will work. So how exactly do we take something like the manufacture of steel and cement? And you're rubbing your hands. You're very excited.
I'm rubbing my hands together.
Like this.
Great
question.
How
do you take the production of steel and cement, which right now is dirty, and try to clean it?
Yeah. Well, okay. Is the question thinking more about this in a policy sense or like a chemical sense?
The question is, it's from Eric. He says, can you elaborate on how funding for advanced industry or manufacturing will work? For example, steel, cement.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that a lot of these policies work is that there is basically a supply push, a demand pull, and some kind of protection for the industry. So in this case, the supply push is there are tax credits in the bill that almost work as direct subsidies that say if you build a kind of advanced manufacturing facility in something, in steel, in solar panels, and whatever, in EVs, the government actually has a lot of ability to kind of decide what it's going to fund, but the government will underwrite up to 30% or more of that investment. There's a demand pull, which says it actually gives the government $5 billion to directly buy like low carbon steel, low carbon cement. But it also creates other places in the economy where kind of private actors are incentivized to purchase the new goods coming out of these new factories. So there's supply push that like creates the things. There's demand pull that like creates demand for the goods that are being produced. And then there's a new tax credit called 45X, which actually goes through and says, in a lot of industries, it actually is trying to protect US manufacturing from Chinese dumping. So in solar, for instance, which I realize is not quite the question, but there's a version of this in a lot of different sectors. It says, what is the cost of producing a solar panel in the US? Mm-hmm. What is the cost of producing it in China? What's the cost difference? It turns out the cost difference is about $3. It says, we will pay you $3 every time you make one in the US, just to cover that cost difference. It's actually quite a potent piece of policy that I think has really not attracted attention. There is a number of other policies in the bill and that the Biden administration has pursued in steel, for instance, to try to create a market for low carbon steel and also to help steel makers retrofit their factories and their refineries and foundries to produce steel in a low to no carbon way. But that's kind of how all the policies work. You have some programs that are meant to change how things are made and make it cheaper to make them. And then you have some programs that are meant to kind of create new markets for what's actually coming out of those factories.
We're getting other questions from the audience, but I want to make sure that I criticize or offer a criticism of this bill from both the right and the left, because there's another prominent criticism from the environmentalist left of this bill, which is essentially, and I don't want to be too glib about it, but it's not mean enough. There's no carbon tax. There's no cap and trade. There's not enough to punish coal or other dirty energy like oil. It's not mean enough to natural gas. It doesn't go far enough to restrain the production of dirty energy that's emitting all of this carbon. Rather, the policy seems more to be about carrots than sticks, more about incentivizing companies and consumers to get in on the green economy. So how do you respond to this idea that like the Green New Deal had a lot more explicit punishment of dirty energy, but this bill is more about carrots than sticks?
The Green New Deal had a lot of ideas about how you might do this. I think the closest one was Bernie kind of had ideas about how you could maybe nationalize parts of the electricity sector. But I think we should be honest that the Green New Deal was like always, including in the according to its supporters, advocates, it was always a bit of an ideal for a program, like an idea about how you might go about this. It did not fully crystallize into policies. That said, I think there is absolutely a criticism of this bill, which is not even a criticism. It is a straightforward description of this bill, that in a lot of ways, the bill ties a lot of the programs that I'm talking about, spending on a lot of the programs that I'm talking about, to cushioning fossil fuel development, to at least providing a pathway there. And there are different policies that we could talk about here, but generally, this bill does not try to close off fossil fuel development in the US. In fact, it kind of says we're going to continue it for at least we're at least going to make it possible sort of for the next 10 years. At the same time, the bill tries to clean up a lot of the worst aspects of that fossil fuel production. So one of the only sticks in the bill, so to speak, is that there's a new methane fee that basically if you're an oil and gas company and you emit methane, which we know to be a mega super global warming pollutant, really traps heat very effectively. If you have a methane leak or you accidentally emit it from your facilities, the government will charge this very large fine on you for doing so. That said, I think that is just a fair, straightforward description of kind of how the bill goes about. And there are political reasons for that. The first is that this was a compromise struck with Joe Manchin, who is from West Virginia, a state with a big coal industry and also a large natural gas industry. He feels kind of culturally loyal to fossil production. He feels like there should be a path for it within a decarbonizing country. But also, I guess what I'd say is the bill did pass.
Right.
And no other bill has done that. And so, and previous climate bills that we talk about being a real missed opportunity, such as Wax the Marquee, also included similar kind of schemes to offer an olive branch to the oil industry. We've seen this in other countries that pass climate policies. It's not an uncommon part of the mix. I think where there's, I think what the bill's advocates say is that this is definitely a wager.
Yeah.
That, we're kind of taking on this bill, but if you look at how the policies are stacked up, there is far more on the decarbonizing side and on the building clean side than there is on the polluting side.
The other thing is that, like, it's very important to me, and I know it's important to you as well, that our energy policy be consistent enough that companies can react to incentives and invest in the long term. And that becomes very difficult when, if you can imagine a sort of thermostatic revolution where Democrats come in and pass the Green New Deal, and then Republicans come in and they scrap it, and then Democrats come in and pass the Green New Deal, and Republicans come in and scrap it, and it ends up becoming a little bit like corporate tax rates, right? They go up, they go down, they go up, they go down, depending on who has control of legislation. That's not good for revolutionizing an energy industry. What you want, I think, are policies that are moderate enough to stand the inevitable switching over of party control in the Senate and the House. And that suggests to me that it's better to have the bulk of green energy policy live within subsidies that somewhat have broad support, or at least not like hateful antagonism among moderate conservatives, because then it won't just be overturned immediately in 18 months. And then what's the point of having a green energy policy anyway if it's just going to be ripped up in 18 months? And so we don't need to go too far into this. You can respond.
No, I think it's there's a devil's advocate. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I didn't mean to fully. There's a devil's advocate position here, which is that kind of negotiating with yourself is a little bit of what Obamacare did. And now the Republicans talked about for years repealing it anyway, even though it was kind of a heritage foundation market-based plan. Now, at the same time, it did survive. And so you can really look at it from both sides. Where I would argue the really wonky thing here, which I will try to keep to a minimum, but I think is actually, what I would argue is actually one of the strongest inflation reducing measures in the Inflation Reduction Act, is that if you just look at how, in order to if we want to plan or strategize about the direction of the economy, I think we also should be realistic about where the economy is going anyway. You have to understand reality as it is, right? And if you look at what is happening in Europe right now, and the way that Russia has weaponized its natural gas, but also the way that other countries that are not in Europe, that are in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia, are beginning to make these development trade-offs between should we build coal, which we have locally, or should we start to build natural gas plants? There is going to be a lot of demand for US natural gas in the next decade. There's just going to be a lot of export demand for US natural gas. We have been export constrained for the past decade, and that has kept natural gas prices in the US very cheap, and that has in turn kept electricity prices very cheap. But those constraints are going away, in part because it is part of the national security imperative for the US to get as much natural gas as it can to Europe. That means that suddenly we're going to be exporting a lot more natural gas, which means there's going to be a larger kind of market for US natural gas, which means domestic natural gas prices are going to go up, which means domestic power prices are going to go up. Because it subsidizes clean energy and really incentivizes utilities to build a lot of wind and solar and non-natural gas sources of electricity generation. I think you could say that the strongest inflation reducing facet in the IRA is actually going to be that over the next decade, as global demand for US LNG, for US liquid natural gas ramps up, there's going to be a cushion to keep US domestic power prices low, which is coming from these actually direct subsidies of electricity production, as long as you're not using natural gas.
I want to take another question from the audience. Gregory says, I've heard that electric vehicles, EVs, will not be available for the majority of interested buyers for a long time. Will the IRA help to ramp up development? And what will prevent car companies from increasing their MSRPs by $7,500 in order to offset the tax incentive?
A great question. The first one is that there's a lot of these supply push policies in the US for EVs in the IRA. So in actually strikingly direct ways, you only get access to car companies will only get access to that full $7,500 credit if a large share of their minerals come from US mines or mines in countries with whom the US has a free trade treaty. Excuse me. Those mines don't really exist today. And there's a lot of other subsidies meant to kind of help get those mines up and running, but it takes a little while to get a mine up and running. And so there actually probably will be a bit of a crunch for EV demand for the next few years. I think the reply is there was going to be that crunch anyway, because high gasoline prices globally are pushing up demand for EVs just generally. And at least these subsidies should help try to bring some of that capacity online sooner rather than later. The question of why won't EV makers just discount their vehicles by the $7,500? The first is that actually there won't, because of these domestic content requirements on the mineral content, but also on how batteries are made in the US, which is like the other half of the $7,500 credit. It's like you only get the full credit if you use US or US allied minerals and make your batteries in North America, just to fully explain the policy. Because of how that works, not all vehicles will qualify for it. And so you could say there's going to be a big advantage to automakers that do qualify not to fully hike the price of their vehicles to compensate. They can get some competitive advantage by using that subsidy to get up on their competitors.
Got it. I want to ask a question, move back to the questions that I had planned for you, because it's really interesting to me that there's this debate that's opened up within the green policy community about the pro-nuclear camp versus the pro-solar camp. And I'm not suggesting that anyone has to position themselves exclusively in one camp or the other. I think solar energy is fantastic, and I think nuclear energy should absolutely be expanded alongside it. But there's this debate about which to emphasize. And in a way, the debate over nuclear versus solar is kind of like a debate about price versus space. The people who are pro-solar say Nuclear energy is fantastic in all sorts of ways, but it's still very expensive, and that cost curve hasn't really been brought down. There's a lot of upfront costs to get a nuclear plant up and running. Solar, on the other hand, the price of solar panels declined by an order of magnitude over the last decade, declined by 90%. That's extraordinary, and we should invest in where the technology is going and therefore invest in solar. Then you have the nuclear camp that says, okay, yes, solar panels have absolutely declined in cost and solar energy is wonderful, but it requires an enormous amount of land. If you're going to entirely replace the US energy grid with, or power the US energy grid exclusively with solar power, it would require covering millions and millions and millions of square miles in the US with solar panels, which is not something that we're very likely to do. Nuclear, however, has a much smaller footprint. So how do you weigh this debate between the nuclear crowd and the solar crowd? What is interesting in this debate to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think it's an interesting debate in part because in some ways, both are making arguments about. I completely agree with you that it is space versus price, but it is also about what space, how we should use space, right? Because on the one hand, solar does just have a larger footprint than nuclear power. And when I think about that, I think, well, that probably means that actually nuclear will do better because you can site it in more compact spaces. You can site it where people are going to be more friendly to nuclear energy. On the other hand, now I should say there's a lot of new advanced nuclear technologies coming online that are much less likely to have the kind of accidents that people get worried about with nuclear power. However, the thing about a nuclear accident is that it does also expand the space that people get concerned about being near a nuclear plant in, right? Like people, like, you know, nuclear plants themselves are very compact. What really scares people is that you're going to have a huge area lost to a nuclear accident. Now, again, a lot of the technologies coming online supposedly are much safer than the existing reactor types that we see at Fukushima or Chernobyl or are, by the way, functioning extremely well in France right now, but like not only in places where there's been accidents. But it is about permitting kind of either way. What I make two observations. The first is the IRA actually, in a kind of refreshing way, really doesn't pick a side between them. It has two, starting in 2025, it has two tax credits, one for producing green energy, the other for producing zero carbon electricity, the second for investing in zero carbon electricity. As a developer, you get to pick one. One kind of gives you a lot of cash up front. The other one is like a nice cash for a long time. And they're both available to any technology that produces zero carbon electricity. That is actually a change from our existing subsidy structure, where only certain technologies such as wind or solar could qualify for certain tax credits. The second thing is that some of the ways that tax credit is designed are kind of meant to help nuclear find, and these new advanced nuclear plants, like find a footing in the US market. So if you build any facility, but specifically an advanced nuclear plant is kind of what will win the most from this policy. If you build an advanced nuclear plant on the site of an old coal plant, the policy will actually pay you, I believe, a 10% bonus. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense, because who lives where there is a closed or closing coal plant? Electricians, like trained IBEW union workers who you will need to staff your new nuclear plant. What already exists where the coal plant is? Well, actually, a ton of the fixed transmission infrastructure to take the huge amount of electricity you're generating and bring it over a wide space, like send it to lots of different areas. Who lives around that plant? You know, people who are already used to accepting the trade-offs of living near a big energy, a big energy producing power plant. And so there are kind of little hints in the bill that kind of point to maybe installing some nuclear plants in places where coal plants have been, as almost a transition for those communities. But the bill as a whole is pretty ecumenical. It says anything, it almost leaves it to the people in charge of the grid saying, whatever kind of zero carbon electricity you need, we're going to support it.
I have a question about the global picture, because it's obviously important what the US does on climate policy, because the US is an extraordinarily high, it's a rich country, it's a big emitter of carbon, even though the per capita emissions have gone down a little bit since the early 2000s, because natural gas seems to have replaced coal to a certain extent. But in the big picture, over the course of this century, we need to worry about global emissions. It's about what China does, it's about what India does, what Africa does, et cetera. What is the story that you would tell that connects this bill and US energy policy to the deployment of green energy technology in places like Africa, India, China? What is that bridge that needs to be built between our policy and the global deployment of this kind of green technology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's two ways of thinking about the way that this bill does connect to global decarbonization. And I would say that something I really admire, frankly, about this bill is that it has a very clear opinion, so to speak, about how the US matters in the global race to decarbonize. Because at the end of the day, the US is only about 12% of global emissions and shrinking. And so while it is important for the US to reduce its emissions for many reasons, I should say the US is only 12% of annual global emissions and declining. Mm-hmm. The rest of the world matters more. The first is that the bill tries to create and tries to push the US toward a advanced American style but zero carbon economy. And I think that it tries to get people in EVs, right? It tries to get solar panels on roofs. It tries to take the American mode of development and say, okay, we're going to do it in a zero carbon way. And I think it's important because the American mode of development is a model to the rest of the world. You know, both intentionally and implicitly, other countries, and this is just a matter of like historical fact, look at the US and say, how can we be more like them? How can we have policies that are more like them? And this policy, you know, this set of policies, if we can get the US to being almost a green leader, then that will pattern how other countries that, according to models, will actually be the biggest share of emissions in 2040 or 2050, develop their economies going forward. The second thing that the bill does is it brings down the cost of clean energy and brings down the cost of all the technologies that we need to decarbonize. And it does that both directly by like subsidizing them, but it also tries to create a domestic industrial base that will like use that tacit knowledge and find all those little process improvements to bring down costs for the whole world. And that then once we're done, you know, decarbonizing the US can then produce the technologies for export that help the rest of the world decarbonize.
You answered it that way because it's a clever way to answer it, because you're saying not only is there sort of like the obvious thing, which is that US has industrial policy on green technology, US exports the technology that they develop both by subsidy and by tacit knowledge, right? We subsidize solar panel manufacturing. And so the people who are manufacturing solar panels figure out clever ways to do it even better, even faster, even more efficient. And then we export that technology. There's that, but there's also this sort of mimetic explanation that like the US embraces a certain theory of climate change policy or anti-climate change policy, and other countries copy us the same way that they would, you know, copy Disney, right? Copy or embrace Coca-Cola. We export a kind of culture of responding to climate change that could potentially affect bills around the world. We have time for one more question, which is a bit of a meta question. This is from Jeffrey. He says, given that the US has been somewhat hands-off in many of these new industrial policy areas for a generation, how will the government get good at industrial policy again? You know, like, have we lost our tacit knowledge in developing good industrial policy? How do we know that this first pancake of industrial policy is any good? It's kind of
I actually think this is a fantastic question, and like one that I'm in some ways most interested to report on going forward, is that the US is trying to revive something that it used to be good at, but that like we kind of did lose the muscle for. And I think it is an open question about, And what the IRA does in a awe-inspiring way is like throw every tool that people can think of at trying to bring back this strength.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is a very fair question to ask, can that be done? Or have we do we all think now in a too laissez-faire way? Have we all lost that muscle? I guess what I'd say is two things. The US has successfully nurtured a couple industries, almost a couple companies over the past decade. We did have these starter industrial policies in the 2009 Stimulus Act. They were much smaller than what existed in the IRA, but they did help companies. They did write loans to companies like Tesla. Mm-hmm. Like Tesla was literally a beneficiary of some of these tiny baby versions of these policies in the 2009 stimulus bill. And it worked there, right? You remember in 2012, Mitt Romney actually attacked the Obama administration for supporting Tesla. Today, Tesla, Elon Musk, is due to speak to the Republican National Committee today or something. So that was successful. But the second thing is that while I think we could say the US civilian side has maybe lost some of this muscle, on the Defense Department side, this is still understood to be something that the US does. Right? DARPA, mm-hmm. which is kind of the DoD's in-house R&D lab, but R&D plus, right? It's meant to actually get technologies to the commercialization or to the mass scaling side, which is responsible for GPS and the internet and all sorts of things, is also responsible for mRNA vaccines. Mm-hmm. And I think there are pockets in the government where this capacity has been maintained. But the big question for the next decade is, can we get that muscle back in time to be useful? I guess the other good side of this, though, is that the rest of the market, the rest of the world will keep functioning. And so you only actually need a few of these policies to really hit in order to have a lasting effect on the US economy.
You and I have both written about how the US is a leader in funding science, and we're obviously world-class at creating enormous corporations that master technologies that might have been invented many decades ago, but we're not necessarily the best at building the ramp between R&D, scientific research, and full corporatization of the technologies developed in that research. We invented the computer, we built the Googles and the Facebooks, but we aren't necessarily always the best at doing something like subsidizing solar or photovoltaic cells and microchips such that we bring down the cost and protect some of the inputs to this technology.
So since our poor participants have signed up for this extremely wonky talk, I'm just going to say one more thing, which is I've wanted to write a story about this forever. My favorite version of this, my favorite fable, mm-hmm. except it's not a fable, it happened, about this is comparing semiconductors and solar photovoltaics. Because at the end of the day, they are actually very, very similar technologies. They were actually invented by basically the same people at Bell Labs within a few months of each other. Both technologies are just layers of polysilicon that you move electrons around. And if you expose polysilicon to light, the electrons move by themselves. And if you use them in other ways, then the electrons, solve math problems for you. And they're like a clock. That's the two technologies. Semiconductors, and in the early application, they were both invented by the same place, same men. And they were both had really early applications in the same place too. So NASA satellites, if you think about them, the first satellites had semiconductors in them, and they had solar panels. That was how you power the semiconductors. Mm-hmm. Semiconductors were commercialized about a decade and a half earlier. And the account that I've heard that I do find compelling here, and it gets at Jeffrey's question.
Texas Instruments, right? I think it was Texas Instruments that built one of the first transistor radios, or?
Allegedly, they were commercialized by New Deal bureaucrats on their last kind of legs. Mm-hmm. And so they were and so they thought about this in a New Deal-y way. They were we got to set up some markets so that first of all the different components of semiconductor go to different companies. Those companies are small companies competing with small companies, medium companies competing with medium companies, big companies competing with big companies. And then they created a market for it. And they also said, the government will buy the fastest semiconductor you can make. If you make a faster one, we'll buy it. What that meant is that when semiconductors commercialized in the 1960s and late 1950s, you could, as a firm, exist just selling one semiconductor a year to the government. And there was an ecosystem of people all working on semiconductors who were like thinking and talking to each other. When solar panels were commercialized, like about a decade later in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the government was like, we're going to do this. But everyone, like the bureaucrats were all like young post-Watergate, like free marketers. And so they didn't pay as much attention to firm size or how you set up these markets. And they also set up the procurement challenge. This is so wonky, I'm so sorry. But like they set up the procurement challenge basically to say, if you make a more efficient solar panel, the government will buy it. There were two issues with that. The first is that you wound up with big companies just hoovering up the solar companies right away. And the big companies, like literally Exxon actually had a really important solar unit, thought, how can we get this to utility scale as fast as we can? And that meant that they overlooked some of the early commercialization opportunities, like for instance, pocket calculators, or like off the grid power creation that wound up being key places where solar technology developed. But the second is that because the government's procurement challenge was around efficiency, firms were competing themselves out of business. You could not exist as a firm and sell like 1 or 2 solar panels a year to the government, because if someone came along with a cheaper or more efficient panel, you were out of luck. Like you had no revenue that year. And so, and then, so the program wasn't working super well. And then the Reagan administration came in the 80s and canceled a lot of DOE programs. A lot of that IP went to Japan, which has a much more aggressive industrial policy. And Sony and Sharp and these Japanese mega companies that like is how Japan does all its industrial development, actually wound up being the first to commercialize solar panels. But the end state of this is by 2000, the US, or even 2010, the US, where solar PV and semiconductors were invented, still made a lot of semiconductors. And it still does today. It just doesn't make the advanced ones. But it made almost no solar PV. And you can see there how ways of thinking about this, how historical accident, how like certain almost bureaucratic muscles do matter in whether these technologies like catch on in the United States and are commercialized in the United States or not.
It's almost like a twin study for technology.
Yes, exactly.
Twins are born and they're raised by different families, and you see like how they grow into entirely different markets, I guess, in this case.
Yes.
It's a great story, and you told it to me before. So I'm glad that you shared it with our webinar audience.
I need to write about it one day.
You need to write about it. It's a really, really good story. Anyway, Rob, thank you so much for doing this. That's all the time we have for today.
Subscribe to my newsletter. I should say they should subscribe to my newsletter as well as yours.
That's exactly right. Yeah, please subscribe to Rob's newsletter, subscribe to my newsletter. If you missed this office hours and you're catching us on YouTube, we do this every second Tuesday of the month, every month. Read more from me and Rob at theatlantic.com and in our new print issue. And if you enjoyed this conversation and want more of The Atlantic, you can support our journalism by becoming a subscriber. And you can visit our website for more info on how to do that. Finally, last point is that after hosting the Atlantic Festival virtually for the past 2 years, 2022 will be the first year it's available for both virtual and in-person attendance in Washington, D.C. this September. You can sign up to register by clicking the link in the Zoom chat that was just posted in the Zoom chat just below. If you're watching this on YouTube, go to The Atlantic and you can subscribe or to figure out how to join the Atlantic Festival in September there. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you in a month. Bye, Rob.
Thanks so much.